So you got two handouts today. You got assignment 201. We'll start by chatting about this. It's due 2 weeks from today on the 24th, so we got lots of time to work on it. You will find over the next several class days that depending on how fast you work, you'll probably end up with extra time at the end of the class periods. That's a really good time to work on your assignment 201s because you can ask me questions if you're running into difficulties. So today we're going to work with kind of round objects and tubes and pipes and that sort of thing, which is relevant toward building chairs most of the time. We've already covered kind of basic extrusions and that sort of thing, and the details of the chamfers and what have you. Next class we're going to go back and talk about texture mapping of objects in V-Ray, so we'll jump back into V-Ray, and that has to do with how your texture looks on an object or how it's applied to the object, what scale is it applied at, and that sort of thing. We will also then, after we spend that V-Ray day, we'll continue with building some more building component type stuff where we're trying to make something. We'll make a window or a door or something with some detail on it and that sort of thing. Then we'll also cover how to make objects that are not rectilinear, the fluffy objects, the pillows, the draperies, that kind of thing. We'll cover that as well. So those will all be covered prior to you having to turn in your assignment 201. The pillows are going to come at the very end because we need to cover a lot of ground before we can get to pillows. So you can still be doing your chair bases without cushions on them and then do the cushions at the end, if that makes sense. If you even want cushions, you don't have to have cushions, right? It's not graded such that, oh, well, you know, you did a cushion, therefore yours is worth more. It's up to you how you want to do it. There are plenty of examples on the course website of previous work. If you go to the course website, we go to Student Work Digital Tools 2, Assignments 201. You can see a bunch of previous work. These people all started out in the same place you did, so you are more than capable of doing these, depending on how certain things turned out. That one turned out really nice, I think. So you've got a lot of choices in terms of how this comes together, and you can look through a lot of the examples. I will caution you right now that if you go find a chair that's already been done, say on Flying Architecture or something, and try to use that as your chair, the same thing happens when we do a lamp later on with lighting conditions and that sort of thing. It won't fly because I've seen them all. I know what they all look like. Trust me, I know what they all look like, so don't bother. Build your own. You get way more points if you just build your own. They don't have to be perfect. I already mentioned that gravity is not particularly relevant. It would be nice if the chair could stand on its own, but I'm not overly worried about that. It's not a physics class. You are doing both a table and a chair. You're only required to do one chair and one table. Though if you want to do a table with multiple chairs, that's perfectly fine. You want to copy and paste the chair and use it over and over again, that's fine too. But it gives you some flexibility. The key pieces here are obviously the geometry that you choose to model and how well modeled it is and the level of detail that you achieve, but also how is the material being applied. Is it applied at the correct scale? Is it applied in the correct manner such that it looks proper? I'm not worried about background environments, what things look like, flooring, lighting, that sort of thing is not relevant for this part of the assignment. It's the table and the chairs. And you see most of these examples that we've gone through have a white background, an all white background with just the tables and the chairs. There's not a lot of shadows being cast on the ground because there's not really any lighting in the scenes, so there's no environments and that sort of thing, and that's perfectly okay because that's exactly what this is about. It's about the table. So here's an example there, the black background, the gray floor, it's about the chair. So that's what we're concerned with. Some of these have better textures applied. Some of them, the textures aren't quite as good. That's what we're going to be looking at primarily. Does that make sense? Okay. So you've got basically 2 weeks of in-class time to work on it, or a little less than 2 weeks of in-class time to work on it. So when you finish early, it would be a good time to start working on it and playing around with it. Okay. So we're going to move into exercise 207. Which, is, like I said earlier, is about building tubes and kind of tubular type objects, dealing with circles and radiuses and that kind of thing. I think it's important to cover this information. What we're building is basically a a metal clamp that would hold a piece of glass in place. It's not the structurally the best example. It's just something that involves a lot of tubes and donuts and stuff like that for you to build, and that's why I want you to build it. So if you don't like it and you want to adapt it a little bit, it's not the end of the world. But again, it's about learning these basic skills like a sweep and what does that mean. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the whole thing with you. If I go a little bit fast and you get a little bit lost, don't worry about it. I'm going to get through the whole thing, and then I'll come around and I'll help you if you get stuck on a particular step. I'm not expecting you to follow along exactly as I do it. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is by drawing kind of a basic shape. In doing so, I need to start with an arc. So I'm going to do an arc, and I'm going to start, because of it's a 2-inch radius, I'm going to go ahead and start at point, or let's see, 2 inches, comma 0, which would start me over from the axis there. We'll go back 2 inches in that direction, and then I'm going to go up, and that builds the first piece of the arc. Where you build this in space really doesn't matter, but you want to notice I'm working in the top view. I could do it in the perspective view, but for right now I'm doing it in the top view. I'm going to continue with the polyline. I think I said 13 inches in that direction. And now once again I want to do an arc at the end. So I could just mirror this, or I could draw the arc again. It really doesn't matter. I'll mirror it for right now. And I can do that going to the transform menu and then mirror, I think, or maybe it's the edit menu. Here's transform. Mirror. I always type mirror. So. Okay, so now I end up with that shape, which is the first shape in step 1 that I was trying to do. I do want these to all be joined together, so I'll select them and then join. If I can find join. Fine. Perfect. And now I'm going to go ahead and rotate this in 3D such that it's up in the vertical direction instead of laying flat on the ground. So I'll do rotate 3D, and I'm going to rotate from here. My rotation axis is this x-axis, and I'll fold it up that direction so it's up in 3D space. One of the interesting things is I could have drawn this same shape in the front view and not had to do the rotate 3D. It's just another way of working. I tend to draw it flat and rotate it up, just how I work. So now I'm going to go ahead and make the perspective view big. And I need to draw 2 circles at each end, or 1 circle at each end. So I'm going to use the circle tool here, and I'm going to snap to the end point. And now this is important. I want to pay attention to what the radius should be, or what the diameter should be. So I'm saying that this should be a 1/2 inch, right? And I want that to be the diameter, not the radius. So I'm going to click on diameter here, and I'm going to specify that as 0.5 inches, okay, which creates that little circle at the end of this object. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. It's really important. The biggest thing people make mistakes on in this is not paying attention to radius versus diameter. And it's going to look funny if you use diameter instead of radius, or radius instead of diameter. It's going to be off. Okay, so we've drawn that circle at a 1/2 inch. Then I'm going to use the command that's called sweep 1, or sweep 1 rail, and it's surface sweep 1 rail, or you can type sweep 1. And it's going to say select cross-section curves. And so the cross-section curve is right there. Oops, hold on. I want to make sure nothing's selected when I do this. Surface, sweep 1 rail, select rail. And so the best way to think of this is, let's say I had a railroad track. Okay? One side of the track, or in the railroad case, it would be both sides of the track. One side of those tracks is basically a rail that the train's going to follow. Okay? The same thing happens here. Says select rail, that's the line that this is going to follow. And so I'll pick this curve as the line that it's going to follow. And then the next thing it's going to prompt is select cross-section curves. So what do I want this shape to have a cross-section of? And so I'm going to pick the circle as my cross-section curves. I could pick more than one curve, note, okay, but I only have one to pick. And I'll go ahead and hit enter. And it's going to say drag scene point to adjust. Okay, because it's basically making a tube. The default is going to be just fine. You can see the little white arrow there pointing. That's fine. And so I'll go ahead and press enter, and it will give me the sweep one rail options dialog box. But if we look at what it did, is it basically created that shape for me. And so it took the cross-section curve and it swept it along this rail, making a solid shape for me. Okay? Generally speaking, you're going to work with freeform as your style. The time that this is going to break down is if you're going to use something, let's say you wanted a road, so you wanted it to be flat on top, you would use road top or road like front, which if I were to switch, it might not. Let me preview and see if it's going to show. Yeah, this is not a good example for one of the other views for how it would work. Yeah, neither of those is going to show. So we'll go back to freeform because it's not the right example for that. So I have this set at freeform. I have this set to do not simplify, which is perfect. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And when I do that, it's basically created a hollow tube for me. Let me go to shaded. That has a thickness to it. And so I took what once was just a line, and I took that cross-sectional curve and I swept it along that shape. Okay? I'm going to take this and I'm going to add to it. In this case, I'm going to add an 1.5" little button on the end here. And so let me go to my circle. And once again, I want this to be again in diameter. So I type D for diameter. This is 1.5 inches. There it is. And I'm going to extrude this, right, so that it has a thickness to it. And let me see if I say what the sorry, I just want to make sure I get my... Okay. I'm saying it should be a 1/2 inch thick. I think I'm going to do it as a 1/4. I'm changing my mind midstream here. So I'm going to extrude curve, and I want it to be solid. So I'm going to make sure I type S or click on solid. Now it's solid, and I want this to go in the negative direction. So I'm going to say negative 0.25 inches, and there it is. Okay. Now I'm going to do a second one of these. Oops. No, stop. And I'm going to copy this, and I want the copy, and I'm going to work in the side view here so that I can see it a little bit better. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to create a second one, and we're going to go down. But I'm going to go down 0.5 inches, and in between those is going to be my sheet of glass ultimately. Okay? So I created a second little copy. This could go all the way through. If you wanted to do just one extrude, that would work fine. It's kind of up to you. I'm going to go ahead and copy both of these, or excuse me, mirror both of these across that mid point so that I create them over here. So I'll do mirror. I'll pick mid, and now I end up with those there as well. Make sense so far? Okay. Now the next piece is I want a second version of these, and I want it at 45 degrees to each other so that they cross. I'm going to look in the top view, and notice that I'm starting to use the views a little bit more, switching between views. And I'm going to rotate, this is just a regular rotate, from 0.00 out that way, and I want it to go 45. And so right now I have ortho on, so it's jumping to 90. I want it to actually just go 45, so I'll type 45 degrees, and that gives me that distance there. Okay? So I have one that's in place. I want the opposite X to happen. So I have two options. I can copy this, right, and rotate the copy. I could, well, that's probably the easiest way. So let me go ahead and go to Edit, Copy, or excuse me, Transform Copy. Transform Copy. And so if I look at this, it says point to copy from. Ideally speaking, I'd like to pick the middle right inside the object right there at the midpoint. So I'll pick that. Now, I could move this, say, over, and I'm going to do one that's over. And then I could rotate that one and then move it back. Or I can pick something that... it should let me copy in place. So let me try a copy in place instead. So let me right-click to repeat the copy. And right here, before I pick the point, see how it says in place? that means I'm creating an exact copy right on top of itself. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay. Now before I deselect anything, the resulting object is the one that's selected. I'm going to rotate this object. So I'm going to use a regular rotate. I'm going to once again pick that center point, and I'm going to rotate it so that it's backwards. And that's then created that stop. Now, if I had done it this way, where I'd made the second copy, I would then rotate this one like that, and then I'd move it back on top. Okay, it's fine. It's just by putting it in place, it saves me the step of moving and then moving it back. Doesn't really matter. As you get more and more efficient in Rhino, you'll start using things like copy in place and then rotate the last command. Rhino is very good at keeping things selected as you go through commands. So if you do it in the right order, and you learn that order, for example, if you do a trim and then you do a patch, you can a lot of times use the same curve for the trim and then follow it with a patch without having to reselect anything, which can be more efficient. So anyway, I've created those pieces, which gives me my little X. The next piece of the puzzle is I'm going to create basically a spire that sticks up with a little donut on the end that can accept a cable. And so I have drawn on the back, right, kind of a breakdown and a side view, projected view of what this little piece looks like. And so you can see right here, I've got an overall dimension of 2 feet. And then I've got 1 foot 9 1/4 and etc. You can build it based on that piece. Personally, I think the easiest way to do it is to build it flat on the ground out here and then move it into place. The other option would be to build it in the front view and then copy it on top there. It just depends on what's the most comfortable for you to work in. I tend to like to build it flat and then do the rotation at the end. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line, right? We'll call it 2 feet for right now. And I just drew it out here in space. And I'm going to use the same technique to sweep, right, and make this a tube. So I'll create a circle, and this time instead of having the circle flat to the ground like this, I'm going to switch my view to be in one of the side views here. Right, such that, and I can kind of look, see how if I'm here, my circle being created is going in the wrong direction. If I'm looking in the perspective view, sorry, I can't point to it. Right, if I'm trying to create the circle here, you can see that the circle's going the wrong way. It's going along the length of my object. If instead I try to create the circle in the right view, we can look up here and say, yeah, the circle's going the correct direction. So now that it's going the correct direction, I'm going to specify that I want it to be diameter, and I want it to be 0.5 inches, and there it is. And so if we zoom back in on the perspective, there's my little circle and there's my line. So once again, I'm going to do the sweep command. So I'll go up to surface, sweep one rail. I'm going to select my rail as being this straight piece. Select cross-section curve. There's the cross-section curve. I'll hit enter. Seam is fine. Default options are fine, and now I've created that tube. Okay, there's a good first piece. Now I need to create the little donut that's on the end. Okay, and so this time I'm going to draw a circle that starts right here, and I want this is the outside diameter is 1 3/4 inches. So again, I need to be in diameter mode, which I am, and I need to be 1.75 inches. There's the outside. Okay, now the inside is 3/8. So I'm going to create an inner circle that is 3/8 of an inch. So again, the diameter, and I'll do 3/8, like that. Okay, and so I'm purposely in this giving you different sizes because it makes this a little bit more challenging. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to create, I have the inside of the circle, I have the outside of the circle, and I need the cross section of what this is going to look like. So the easy way to do it is to again use the circle command, but I'm going to use a different circle command. So if I click and hold, you can see that underneath the normal radius circle, I have create a circle with the diameter. Okay? And so I'm going to create a circle with the diameter such that I can pick, right, this edge and that edge. And on a circle, if we want to get to one of the quarters of the circle, so to speak, I can turn on what's called quad snap down here, and that's going to snap to the quadrant of the circle. So if this was like north-south, you could snap to north, south, east, or west of the circle, if that makes sense. Right? And it's right there. So I'll go ahead and have quad snap on, and I'll snap from here over to there. And I've now created that third circle. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this circle isn't in the correct view just yet. It's not in the correct direction. So I'll use a rotate 3D to rotate this. And we'll go from here to there. And we'll fold it up into 3 dimensions there. Now that I have this, I can once again do that sweep. And so the thing about a sweep is at this point it doesn't matter whether I sweep around the inside or I sweep around the outside, it's going to give me the same result. So if I do a sweep 1, select the rail, there's my rail, select cross-section curve, there's my cross-section curve, I hit enter, seam is fine, it's going to build the little donut for me. Okay? If instead of doing it that way, I said, okay, let's do it, there's my rail, there's my cross-section curve, oops, sorry, surface, sweep 1, there's my rail, there's my cross-section curve, that's my seam, it's going to turn out exactly the same. Right? So it doesn't matter where that rail is, it actually doesn't have to be touching the object at all, it's just what it's going to follow. So I'll go ahead and say, okay, now that that's done, and so I have a nice geometry made up here. I need to do some trimming, however. So let's go ahead and select this object as my trimming surface. I'll type trim, and we need to get rid of that part of the surface. Okay, that looks pretty good. And so now I have this as 2 feet long, right to the center, which is what it needs to be, and that's from the glass surface. So let me take this whole object and rotate 3D, transform, rotate 3D, and stand it up. I've left the curve that's in the center because it'll help me manipulate the object. That's going to be my rotation axis, and I'm going to fold it up that direction. Right there. And now I need this piece to move such that it's right here, right in between that X. And so I can go ahead and move. So I'll go to transform and then move. And I'm going to do this in 2 pieces. I'm going to go from here first to that center, such that it's on top of my object, like that. But I also know that this has to come down to be at the ground level. So I'll switch into my side view so that I can see it better. And we're going to move. And we're going to move from there, and we're going to reference one of these side points. Hopefully. Let me reference. Okay. It's being very annoying and not letting me do that. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a line to snap down to. So let me go from, right, it's from the surface of the glass. Let me go from the center, turn on center, of that circle to the center of center of that circle, and then we'll move this down. So I'll type move, and we'll go from right here to the midpoint there, and that then creates that part of it. Now once again I have to do a little bit of trimming, so we'll trim. And it doesn't matter which one we use as the trim. That'll work. And I've now created, right, that object. So there's a little bit more to it that I want to finish. I want to put the little steel cable in. So this is very similar to the sweep that we did before. This steel cable is 6 feet in that direction. There we go. And I'm going to sweep 1 again. So surface, sweep 1. Pick the inside circle there. Oops, the rail first. There's the rail. There's the cross section. There's the seam. Okay, there's my little cable. Now obviously gravity doesn't apply because this is standing straight up. So I have that. That's good. Now I want a piece of glass installed as well. So we'll once again use that as the base of my glass. So let me do, I'm going to do just a box from that point. It's a 4x6 sheet of glass, so I'm going to go at, so relative coordinates, 4 feet, comma 6 feet. Oops, I have it going in the wrong direction. My fault. I should have paid attention. At negative 6 feet, comma 4 feet. There it is. And I want my thickness to be equivalent to the gap between these two pieces. And of course, I accidentally clicked. Try that one more time. So we're going to go at negative 6 feet, comma 4 feet. Perfect. And I'm going to reference, hopefully, that right there, create my overall thickness of that piece of glass. So when it's all said and done, I have a nice piece of glass here. I have my little clamp. I have my rod, and I have my little tension cable. Now, all of these pieces are ultimately going to be used to chain together, which is why I built just 1/4 of it, if that makes sense. So long term, I'm going to take this and we'll put a bunch of them together. I'm just doing this temporarily. We're going to do this with blocks, not by just copying and pasting. But I want to show you how this works. Such that you can start to see how the reason I built just that piece is that this could eventually make a seamless glass wall, right, with little metal clips on them. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay, so I do want to do a little bit of organization of this file. So right now I've paid no attention to my layers, but I'm going to come back and deal with my layers. I want a layer that's going to be called glass, and I want a layer that's going to be called metal. And I'll use the default layer and rename that, and we'll call this, I don't know, glass unit, something like that, okay? I'm also going to make these two layers, and I held down shift to select them both. I'm going to make them sub-layers of the glass unit. So I'm just going to drag them on top of the glass unit layer, and they become sub-layers, thank you. And so I'm going to select each of the glass panels and make sure that they go on the glass layer. So I'll right click and say apply or change object layer, and I can tell that they changed because the color changed, right? And then I want the rest of the objects, so we will select all and then turn off the glass, so I have the other pieces, and we'll make those on the metal layer. So let me change object layer. Good. And so now I have both applied with layers, and now it's time to apply some materials to them. And so what I'll do is I'll open my materials editor again, right click on scene materials, load material, and I'm going to pick off of that Q drive in resources a glass material. So let me go to materials, we'll go to glass, basic glass, open, and I'm also going to load material, and it will be metal, and it depends on what I want for metal. I don't know, let's do, I guess, an aluminum, sure, and we'll do a shiny aluminum. Why not? So, okay, so I have shiny aluminum, I have basic glass. Because I've separated these out onto layers, I can assign the materials to the layers, not to the individual objects, which long term is what you're going to want to do. So on the layer here, you see how there's that white circle next to the color? That's where I'm going to click and apply the material. So under glass, I'm going to click on that circle, and instead of being from here, I'm going to check the box down here that says plugin, and I can then browse and apply basic material, basic glass, and say okay. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to go inside your material editor, right click on the material, and say apply material to layer instead of selection. Sometimes this is easier. And it's going to bring up your layers list, and you could say, no, I want it to be on the metal layer. You say OK. And now that's been applied. Okay? These right now are sitting, unfortunately, in the ground plane, which is not going to help me for any kind of a rendering. So I'm going to rotate 3D to get them up into the vertical plane. So we'll go from there up. And let's do a few more just for fun. So I'm going to do a copy. That's it there. There. All right. And now, oops, I'm going to add an infinite plane underneath. Render like that. This infinite plane showed up on the metal layer. I don't want it to be on that layer. I want it to be on its own layer. So we'll call this one infinite plane. And we'll change object layer. All right. And now I'm looking down slightly because I want to be able to see. We can start to see, obviously the glass is very transparent glass, so it's going to look almost completely clear, but you can start to see all of the little spiders showing up there as well. Okay, so this is what you're going to do. You're going to create that rendering. You can copy and paste it. You can render just the one. It doesn't really matter for me. Good. And that's it. If you finish early, go ahead and start on your table and chair. And you know, this is, again, an exercise, so if things aren't perfectly accurate, it's not the end of the world, but this is a good time to really learn about tubes and how you do sweeps and that sort of thing. I will show you really quickly what a sweep 2 rail does. Let me just turn these off for a second. Because I want you to see that. Okay? If I have in space a curve, and I have a second curve, and that, and I have an object that's going to go between them, and for right now we'll just use the same circle. Let me do a quick rotate 3D on it. Okay, so this is a similar concept. Okay, if I were to do a sweep 1, okay, if I went surface, sweep 1 rail, use that as my rail, use this as my cross-section curve, perfect. I would end up with basically a tube, right? We've got some issues because of how it's doing it, but you get the idea, right? It's making basically a tube. If, however, maybe there's a better way of showing this. If instead of that, however, I do a sweep 2, it's going to change this cross-sectional curve based on how it passes across the first and second rail. So there's the first and second rail. Oops. First, second, no. First rail, second rail, cross-section curve, enter. Okay, as the two get further apart, they get bigger. Does that make sense? So one of them is going to keep the same cross-section along the length of whatever the curve is. The second option is going to get bigger or smaller the further apart they get. And so maybe those are too curvy as good examples. Let me do a different one. So I'm just trying to pick an example that might be a little bit clearer. Okay, so I'll do a sweep 1. Let me change this into shape out here. Sweep 1, first rail, and cross section. Okay, and I end up with that, right, as my tube. Okay, if instead I did a sweep 2, first rail, second rail, cross section, all right, it's going to get bigger and then smaller. Does that kind of make sense how that works? So you can already start to see that there are some really good ways of making unique shapes should you want to make a unique shape. So I wanted to point out the difference between the sweeps. The key to understanding today is making sure you understand sweeps and how they work. Okay. The other thing that we can play around with a little bit is instead of doing this circle example, let me change for just a second here. Bear with me for just a second while we adjust a few things here. Okay, so in this instance, I have a curve that's gently arcing upward, right? I'm going to draw a rectangle at one end. Something like that. Now if I sweep, there's the rail, there's the cross section. Perfect. Okay, this is where we may get into some of the other options. Okay, so this first one is the free form, and you can kind of see how it twists as it goes up. Okay, if I copy this instead, and sometimes the only real good way of showing this is to do it, right? And we do a sweep 1, rail cross section there. Perfect. And this is where we might do road-like top, and it's going to keep it flat all the way up. And so instead of banking, like this one does, right, if you see them side by side, this one stays flat and horizontal as it goes up. Does that kind of make sense? Road-like top. And so if we look at the difference, right, this one, especially right here, banks up as it follows that curve. This one next door, side by side, stays perfectly flat at any point along the curve itself. So we don't get that little bit of a bank. So that shows you the slight differences in how you make the sweeps in terms of what you ultimately create. So if you were building, for example, an architectural ramp that went from one place to another, you'd probably use the road-like top because you want it to be flat at any point along the surface. If you were building a race car track, you might use the freeform because you want it to bank on the curves. And it just depends. Okay? So just different strategies for how the sweep works. Okay? So I'm going to let you guys go and do this exercise 207. If you finish this piece, go ahead and start on your table and chairs and start thinking about that. Okay?